A warm welcome from my side and in the name of the OECD Economics Department to all our participants today, and of course, warm welcome in particular to all our panelists. My name is Isabel Koske. I'm Deputy Director of the department's Country Studies branch. It's a great pleasure to have so many people connected today for our webinar on emerging market economies. The topic of this webinar could not be more timely. We are living in difficult times. The COVID-19 pandemic and also the war in Ukraine have caused unbelievable human suffering. And the associated economic challenges are huge as well. Surging inflation, recent questions about energy and food security, and also supply chain disruptions have vividly demonstrated that. Navigating these waters will be difficult even for the world's most advanced economies, but it will be particularly challenging for emerging market economies, given that they are often characterized by significant additional vulnerabilities. Many EMEs are significantly exposed to developments in the global economy, be it for imports of food and other essential goods, or through the dependence on external financing. And weak institutional frameworks in many EMEs are sometimes struggling to deliver strong policy responses. This current juncture holds many challenges for emerging market economies. First, with lower incomes, the populations are likely to suffer more from significant cutbacks in consumption due to the rising prices that we are seeing. In the worst case scenario, we may soon see a food catastrophe, as the title of this week's Economist magazine suggested. Second, with weakened fiscal accounts after a long pandemic, many EMEs are facing the limits of the additional support they can provide to their populations. And third, rising global interest rates will raise the cost of financing public debt, which in some countries is exacerbated by significant exchange rate exposure. Previous episodes of rising global interest rates have generally been very difficult times for EMEs, particularly when surprise events triggered strong market reactions. So there's important risk here as well going forward. But there are also more longer-term structural challenges arising from recent events. First, what will be EME's export prospects in a changing global trade environment? Will global income convergence and the overall decline in inequalities, will that continue? And what's the role for EMEs in the energy transition and the global fight against climate change? And finally, what kind of structural policy reforms can foster stronger, more inclusive, and also more sustainable recovery? These are very difficult, but also very fascinating questions for which you would like to turn to today's distinguished speakers, all of whom combine a unique academic and policy experience at the same time. Let me quickly introduce them. First, we have Laura Alfaro, who is Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. She served as Minister of National Planning and Economic Policy in Costa Rica from 2010 to 2012. So she combines indeed, the two experience, both, academic and an actual policymaking experience. She's also the author of multiple articles published in leading academic journals, and she's co-editor of the Journal of International Economics and the World Bank Research Observer. Then we have Otaviano Canuto. He's a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South, a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings Institution, a professional lecturer at George Washington University, and principal of the Center for Macroeconomics and Development. And previously, he held senior positions at the World Bank, the IMF, and also the Inter-American Development Bank. He's also former Deputy Minister for International Affairs at Brazil's Ministry of Finance, and a former Professor of Economics at the University of Sao Paulo and University of Campinas in Brazil. Then we have Arvind Superman. He was the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India between 2014 and 18, and is now with Brown University. Previously, he taught at the Harvard Kennedy School and was a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Foreign Policy magazine actually named him as one of the world's top 100 global thinkers in 2011. Among the major ideas and policies he initiated and helped implement was India's simplified goods and services tax, which we have also very closely followed here at the OECD, not least our desk dealing with India. And then last but not least, we have Rabah Areski. He's a senior fellow at Harvard Kennedy School. And before that, he served as chief economist at the African Development Bank and as chief economist of the World Bank's MENA region. He has also worked at the IMF, where he was chief of the commodities unit in the research department. With this, let me now give the floor to our panelists. We will organize the discussion in 2 rounds. In the first round, I would like to ask you to focus in particular on the macroeconomic challenges that you see for emerging market economies and the priorities in terms of public policies. As all of you have particular regional expertise, feel free to give special attention to the region or the country, but also try, of course, to draw some parallels among EMEs whenever you can. In the second round, I would then ask you to focus more on structural questions and structural policy challenges. And then afterwards, we'll leave space for questions from the audience. For that, please use the chat function of Zoom if you would like to ask a question to our panelists, and we will try to take as many questions as possible. Now let's start with the first round, because I've already talked a lot. So the first person to speak will be Laura Alfaro, who actually has a presentation to share with us. So yeah, Laura, the floor is yours.
Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Thank you for the invitation. As you know, Costa Rica has formally and officially now joined the OECD. So this will be my first presentation as an official member of the OECD. So I took the opportunity to go back a little bit and think about when this pandemic started. So if we go back, this is data from the IMF, April 2020. And as you remember, we all were very, very worried, uncertainty. I was one of those that was in a bunker in the basement of my house, not leaving the house. Expectations of GDP growth negative for most countries. When you go and see expectations of growth rates collapsing 6%, 7%, 8%. So again, a generalized concerns. If we zoom into emerging markets, what is interesting, and at least this is perhaps more in Latin America, the economic shock came before the health shock. So at least in my country, Costa Rica, we closed the economy with very few cases. And again, there was this generalized fear of the disruption of supply chains, the collapse of trade, commodity prices, remittances, foreign direct investment, capital flows. And again, most of these actually materialized before the health shock became severe. And in many countries in Latin America, as you know well, these were the countries that perhaps suffered the most in terms of death for many reasons. Again, but still the economic shock came before the health shock. As we know, unprecedented policies by the government, central, state, local, the multilaterals, but also I would argue by the private sector. And so you remember we had this discussion, what type of recession we would get, a V, a U, a W, an L. And if we go and look at 2 years later, when the historians are going to judge this crisis, it is not likely that they're going to claim it was VW-ish, but the recovery was fast for most countries. And again, this is April 2021, even if you go and look at more recent, you see it was indeed deep recession in most countries, but relatively fast recovery. And again, even in emerging markets, we didn't see what was expected in capital flows, but even remittances, not only, they didn't go down, they actually went up. And again, most of it due to a lot of the policies. But I think now, again, and we do need to keep in mind that at the time there was a lot of uncertainty, but I do think it's time to evaluate. And one outcome that is coming is that perhaps we did too much and for too long and a little bit late. There's this very interesting paper by Otter and al. Evaluating the PPP policies in the US. And it is not the case that it didn't increase employment, but if you do a cost benefit, each job saved costs close to $2,000 and $50,000 for a median income period wage in the US of 50,000. So to save one job, we spend 5 times the value of one job. There's other research, Chetty and co-authors also finding very little impact on some of these policies. And again, I'm not saying that we didn't save jobs, but in a cost benefit evaluation of policies, it does seem that the saving of these jobs was costly. And I would say that a lot of these policies were implemented where there was a little bit more certainty in terms of what was done. So they were a little bit late and also long. This is the US. Right now, again, it seems that there is 11 openings for 11 million openings for 6 million unemployed. If we look at the CPI also, some sense that too much for too long. If you look at housing, at least in Massachusetts, people were buying houses cash with no inspection. So people are gonna walk into a house that needs a lot of fixing at a time that you cannot find anyone who will put a doorknob. And the stock market, again, we see now what's going on. There was a very quick increase and now some reversals, but we need to keep in mind that this was the pension, the tuition money, the down payment for many people who last year felt that they had a lot of money, and this year, again, we had a lot of uncertainty. There's a discussion on commodity prices, and no one can deny that the war, the invasion of Russia to Ukraine has had impact. But if we go and look at the data, the price that went down during the crisis was energy and thus fertilizers. Apparently people are finding out the amount of energy that is required to produce nitrogen, but prices of food never went down. So a lot of the stimulus already was chasing food, and thus now we see a double whammy. And as we know, poor countries disproportionately spend their income on food, and so this was happening even before the invasion. We also had a setup of very high debt levels, the outcome of a decade of low interest rates. We continue to push debt to poor countries. And again, Ken Rogov has had a discussion on this. We push this debt. People know it's not going to be paid. So it's unclear why we just are not open about it and give grants instead of aid. But we seem to go into these rounds that we pretend that it's debt and that we forgive the debt. And there's a moment that this has implications. One of the implications is that, and this is data from Carmen Reinhardt and co-authors, that we are just not seeing private lending to very poor countries. And what is interesting is that default in the 80s were defaults to the private sectors. Defaults now are defaults to China. So the composition has changed, and this is likely to have implications. I'm not going to talk about education because I want to discuss it in the next round. But again, going back, it was a health shock, and I think we have done here a lot. Treatments, testing, equipment, vaccines is not over, and we need to continue the effort. We had unprecedented policies, but in a background of very high leverage individuals, firms, and governments. I was always concerned about the uncertainty, precautionary savings, where people going to spend, if so, when, what will need investment, what will stay. And now we have stories like Peloton that before everyone wanted a bike, now no one wants a bike. But these very abrupt changes in demand do have consequences in terms of making it very hard for firms to be able to know what to invest and where to invest, with consequences. But also, I was also worried about this policy of saving every job, every firm versus a more targeted policy, because it also assumed that there was not only the fiscal space to spend, but also the capacity to spend well. And many countries do have institutional limitations. I worried about my country, and we tend to call it the mano peluda, the hairy hand. And I worried that we were pushing a lot of money to countries that didn't have the capacity to spend that fast. It turns out the US, one of those countries, they didn't have the capacity to spend well all the money that was spent. And again, we keep thinking about all it takes every crisis, but now I'm old enough to have lived many of these crises, that the crisis of the 80s, the emerging market 90s, tequila, Asia, Russia, Brazil, Argentina, September 11, global financial crisis, COVID, the invasion of Ukraine, climate. So we need to think how we're going to do this, because these crises are happening, and sadly more often than before. And it seems that the policies are designed to fight the last crisis, and I wonder what are the effects in politics. And again, I do think it's time now to do a cost evaluation to try to implement, if possible, better policy suited for the next crisis next time. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Laura. Let's now directly turn to Otaviano for his views on the issues.
Thank you. Thank you, Isabel. And it's really a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Laura's presentation facilitated my take in the sense that she laid out quite clearly what would be a conjunction of whammies affecting emerging markets in general. Last week, an article at the Financial Times by Chris Gills, is the global economy heading for recession? He quoted Tolstoy, saying that if Leo Tolstoy were writing about today's business conditions, he might have noted that happy economies are all alike, but every unhappy economy is unhappy in its own way. In our case, the emerging markets, one might say that the quintuple whammy, let's say, are making them all unhappy, but in each one of them in its own way. And I will naturally focus here on Latin America as a complement to my colleagues. But what would be the quintuple whammy? As laid out quite well by Laura, the pandemic, a plague that left debt legacy, labor market scarring. We have not seen, let's say, a full labor market recovery. And we have what has been now called by our BIS friends inequality hysteresis. We have seen rising informality, and also the effects of the pandemic on education that we will discuss later. But we have a second whammy, of course, which is the war in Ukraine and the corresponding and afterwards the commodity price shocks on both energy and food, and inflation. Inflation as a consequence, or at least one of the causes of the global inflation. There is also the excess demand as highlighted by Laura, but the fact of the matter is that inflation is high everywhere outside Asia, with real wage falling and inevitably rising food insecurity and higher energy price. And then we also have to take into account a third whammy, which has been the high frequency of weather-related events impacting energy and harvests. Brazil, for instance, last year, the drought had an impact on the availability of energy, given the high dependence on hydroelectricity, but also, the drought had an impact on harvests, and it also applies to Argentina, Canada. And this year, we have already seen how the temperatures in India's wheat, corn will definitely impact the harvest of wheat in India, which has become, particularly under the circumstance, a very important source. Of course, all this has been compounded by the adoption of protectionist policies of banning export, starting from Russia holding exports of fertilizers to the neighbors, but also now we had the other week India, Indonesia on sunflower oil, and so on. And this has compounded the effects on food products. So these three first whammies, they sound even, it's something serious to play with, but they sound apocalyptic in the sense that, particularly in the case of the weather-related events, because they might be reflecting a once and for all change in the regime of rains and so on. But then we have two additional whammies: China, the new outburst of the pandemic, and leading China with the zero COVID policy to do stringent lockdowns. Fact is that I saw recently, yesterday, some high frequency data on activity, on trade, and on shipping of China. And so far, at least so far, there have been limited signs of spillovers, but it's still early. And given the China's sizable role in global manufacturing supply chains, this elevates the risks of further disruptions in the following weeks and so on that could add upward pressure on global goods prices and crimp goods production. But a range of factors point to less of an additional impulse to good price inflation than last year. Demand is slowing outside of China. And also, it's important to note that there are signs that production has shifted from China to other emerging market Asian exporters, and that should additionally cushion the shock to global supply chains. But then we have a fifth whammy, which is tightening global financial conditions, together with the dollar appreciation, particularly vis-a-vis the other major currencies. It has been the case vis-a-vis the emerging markets, but interestingly, this time the appreciation of the dollar has been remarkable, particularly against other currencies. Let's see if the shift of stance by the European Central Bank might, let's say, calm down the dollar appreciation. And it matters, as we all know, given the typical structure of debt of many or most emerging markets, dollar appreciation is not good. Let me then rapidly focus on particularly two of those whammies. One, obviously, the commodity price shock. The commodity price spike began in 2021 and gained further momentum on the back, of course, of the invasion of Ukraine. And truth be said, that it could bring some boost to Latin America's export-dependent economies. It's not by chance that the forecasts have been reviewed upward by not only institutions, but Latin institutions, but also analysts and so on. And of course, this raised the question of whether the current commodities boom could be the trigger for faster growth rates in a region that has been in slow growth mode ever since the end of the commodity supercycle in the first half of the last decade. And there is indeed, you can find a strong correlation between commodity prices and economic growth in all commodity-dependent Latin American economies. On the other hand, let's say, there are the aspects that we have to learn to reckon with respect to the dependence on such drives in price of commodities, because it makes it vulnerable to price shocks and cycles of boom and bust. This was crystal clear by the period of post-boom adjustment that followed the end of the last commodity supercycle in 2014 or 2015, if you look at the oil price. And the question is whether the current spike in commodity prices will, let's say, bring back faster growth in Latin America. Unfortunately, there are some things that make this time different. First of all, the global economy now appears to be in a weaker position than in the last commodities boom. After all, it has taken extreme supply shocks, the pandemic and the war, to drive up commodity prices to the peaks where they are, hopefully peaks. Meanwhile, concerns, as well as I said, are growing about the health of China's economy and the new normal of growth in China, that even post-pandemic, how downward will adjust the taking into account the rebalancing and so on, Chinese economic growth, which matters a lot for particularly South America, that has today China as the major client. And also the domestic fundamentals in Latin America, this time, they look worse than they were in the previous period of the previous commodities per cycle. Because if we recall, Latin America entered the global financial crisis back in 2008 in reasonably good economic health. Public debt was low, banking sector was healthy, and the efforts by the major central banks in the region to take the wheel on inflation expectations had worked out. And we, by Latin American standards, we had been through a period of low inflation. But now, of course, like the US and the rest of the world, except maybe Asia, as I mentioned, Latin America is now grappling with its own inflation problem. Despite the fact that an aggressive monetary tightening cycle began over a year ago, and this will be weighing on credit, investment, and consumption. But the region's public debt is much higher now too, what leaves government with a lot less room for maneuver to handle this latest economic crisis. But we can say that clearly the commodities boom may not take long, but in the short term, it has provided growth relief for instance, Brazil. The IMF came with a change from 0.3% GDP growth to 0.8. It's still mediocre, but a slight improvement. But the problem is that the inflation, the commodity price shock and inflation, has also been beneficial in terms of, if one may call it that way, for the seigniorage that has made possible for the public sector accounts. But the inflation itself hurts the poor, particularly an inflation that is pulled by rising prices of food and domestic forms of use of energy by poor people. And this obviously increases the risks of social unrest, as been alluded to by Laura, and with negative consequence. Now, so this is a good sign for, of course, the South American commodity exporters, and not so good news, the commodity price shock for Central America or even Mexico. At the same time, the response in terms of monetary policy has broadly been in the right direction, which raises the likelihood of a slowdown in growth and so on. Okay, running to the end of this first intervention, we have the other one, which is the rising global interest rates and the fears about external imbalance. External imbalance is not only seen from the standpoint of composition of debt, that is to say, vulnerability, potential vulnerability of Latin American countries to foreign currency debt, but also the current account. In this case, the picture is much better than previously. For instance, inevitably, we compare things as they are today with how they were in 2013 when we had the taper tantrum and so on. Of the overall, in terms of developing economies, non-advanced economies, the fragile five of 2013 are now in better shape, except for Turkey. But when it comes to balance of payments, current account deficits, and gross external financing needs, not only the fragile four are no longer there, but also in general, the figures are not as bad as they were previously, particularly in the case of the large countries, both in terms of presence of dollar in the composition of public debt, but also the current account deficits, in some case even surplus, and and gross external financing needs. So this is, of course, it doesn't mean that the rise in interest rates will not affect the Latin American economies in the sense that, you know, local interest rates will have to be lifted. We have seen already a depreciation of some currencies. That the case of Brazil, for instance, that had an appreciation since last year, and then part of that appreciation has been given back to the dollar. This is a challenge, but I would dare to say that this is not the major risk faced by Latin American economies in general. Of course, when we go to the detail, we have different situations. I mentioned the differences in commodity dependence. Also, in terms of public debt and the burden of interest payments. Brazil is a case in which you have the spending ceiling in señorage from the inflation, but the noise about tweaks in the framework is always a source of noise and so on. But you have concerns about debt in Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, Dominican Republic, El Salvador. In the case of Costa Rica, particularly the interest payment burden. And interesting, we had unusually high private savings funding fiscal deficits without much external borrowing, and that's what explained a bit what I said about the less vulnerability to the adjustment in global financial conditions. Chile and Colombia are a bit different because they were really forceful in their policies, and their fiscal and current account deficits went over 5% of GDP last year. Chile is already making progress in the sense of adopting more contractionary fiscal policy. Inflation will also is a more general problem. And then we have the risks of political instability in nature and legal and regulatory risks. So overall, this is, I would say, how to look at how each of the Latin American economies are facing the common unhappiness of the quintuple whammy, but in different ways individually. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Otaviano. After this zooming in on Latin America, let's now move continents. Let's move to Asia. Arvind, please.
Thanks to the OECD for inviting me. Happy to be on this panel with very illustrious colleagues. Isabel, before proceeding, I just wanted to check whether, you know, the twofold division between short-term macro and structural still holds, because, or are we running short of time and we should do it all together?
Frankly, I mean, given that, you know, I mean, the others focus a little bit on structural already, but they may have more things to say. And so in this sense, I think we would like to stick, you know, to the 2 rounds. So if you could just focus briefly maybe on the macro, and then, you know, we directly move on to the second round and go back also to you on the structure, I think that would be best. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try and stick to that. But the way I want to situate the context somewhat differently from, you know, just identifying the shocks, because I think we are witnessing 5 major kind of regime shifts, and that's what's unsettling everyone in the global context. Shift number 1, I think basically we've moved from 20-25 years of excess supply or generous supply, convergence, everything, to a regime of, you know, inadequate supply and more excess demand. And, you know, so the China slowing down of convergence is part of that, because China added to global supply, India added to global supply. Now the China slowing down considerably, that global excess supply because new labor market entrants, 1 billion, 2 billion, that's over or slowing down. And we're in a situation of, therefore, now much more scarcity and excess demand. And that's the big first structural shift in the global economy. As a result of that, the second global shift we're seeing is moving from cheap money to not so cheap money, which is going to have all kinds of short-run and long-run complications. Regime shift number 3 we have moved from a situation of hyper-globalization, not necessarily to complete deglobalization, but certainly no more hyper-globalization, with, I think, very not just negative, but also creating opportunities, structural opportunities for countries, which I will come back to in the second round. So from excess supply to excess demand, from cheap money to not so cheap money, from hyper-globalization to less globalization, for a complete shift in geopolitics, beginning with the US-China confrontation, the rise of two power, a rising power and a status quo power kind of clashing. And now on top of that, we've added the Russian dimension. So there's a real structural shift on geopolitics. And finally, a corollary of this, the fifth big structural shift, is a complete collapse of international cooperation. I'm going to give you, I think COVID was, international cooperation was shambolic. I think the poor countries of the world realized that if you rely on the rich world for essential medicines, you have no chance, and global cooperation fell down dramatically. We've seen that with the protectionism, and now we're seeing this, as Otaviano quite rightly said, in the context of commodity prices. We've, in a sense, gone from a G1, G2 world that we were before, basically in a G- world, where there's basically countries are supplying international public bads rather than public goods. So excess supply to excess demand, cheap money to not so cheap money, hyper-globalization to less hyper-globalization, a completely different geopolitics, and the complete breakdown of international cooperation. So what does that mean for the short run? In the short run, I think that the whole food crisis, the breakdown of cooperation, means that on top of the war shock, the Russia shock, you have a policy shock of everyone imposing export controls, which is going to exacerbate the food crisis, the shortages globally. So in the short run, for the poorest parts of the world, it's not just the original shock, but the compounding breakdown in cooperation and nationalistic policies, which will compound that. So it's going to be much worse for many parts of the world, especially net food importing countries in the poorer parts of the world. The other short-term implication, and I'll stop here on this, is that certainly in a country like India, but many countries like that, I think there are going to be severe macroeconomic stresses in the short run as well. And I suspect this is going to be more general than just in India for two reasons. I think one, others have spoken about, and Carmen Reinhardt has famously spoken about, is when you go from a regime of cheap money to not so cheap money, the previous buildup of leverage that you had under cheap money is going to come back and haunt countries around the world. Most famously, we see Sri Lanka has kind of defaulted on its debts because it overborrowed. Prices went up, export revenues declined. I think, and a lot of this, a combination of rising rates, rising dollar, corporate balance sheets, debt denominated in dollars goes up, and therefore I think we're going to see more kind of financial events around the world, and even kind of more conventional kind of macroeconomic kind of stresses. In countries like India, you see some of this, but I think because India has a big amount of foreign exchange reserves, it's able to cushion against some of the outflow of capital and so on. But countries that have less of a cushion, and if they're not able to tap money easily, and one manifestation of that, as I think Laura or Tanya pointed out, is that we already see this, but not in terms of defaults to conventional creditors, but more and more to China as a creditor. So we're going to see breakdown of cooperation affecting low-income countries via food. I think the era of cheap finance going away means many more macro and financial stresses around the world. And in India, for example, we're getting this, some symptoms, but because we're protected, it's not a problem. But Sri Lanka, you've seen this playing out. The third, I think, what is quite distinctive about the cheap money era over and the previous buildup of leverage is that in order to combat inflation, for example, this is playing out in India, to combat inflation, there's an immediate conflict between tackling inflation and fiscal dominance. If your public debts have built up so hugely in the past, and you also have inflation, central banks are, no longer have the confidence to raise interest rates as easily as smoothly because, there's a lot of public debt and governments are inevitably applying pressure, for interest rates not to rise. So the macro situation also, because of this regime shift, has made things much more difficult in emerging market countries. So 5 big regime shifts, at least, for different parts of the countries, different parts of the world, food consumption going down, conventional macro financial crises in others as cheap finance goes away, and macroeconomic stabilization, public debt, inflation, that trade-off is playing out. So these are at least 3 manifestations, or short-term manifestations. I will come to the longer-term consequences of these 5 regime shifts in the second part of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Arvind. A very interesting, way, I think, to see and systematize things. Let's now move on to Rabah, hopefully to also hear a bit about Africa, which is obviously, suffering a lot, I think, from the current crisis, because many of the countries are not in the fortunate position as many Latin Americans, for instance, in terms of being commodity exporters. Rabah.
Thank you, Isabel. So I'll be quick, given that we may be running out of time a bit. So I'll make 3 quick points following on the previous speaker. So I'll go back on the COVID crisis and the lesson we learned from that. And then I'll talk about the consequences of the Ukraine invasion on Africa, and I'll also touch on the Middle East. And last, I'll look at the way forward on that. So on COVID, so clearly the bottom billion soon to become 2.5 billion by 2050, and a continent that's home to 70% of the world poor, had witnessed its first recession in a quarter of a century on account of COVID. The continent had, prior to COVID, a good run. Even so, in per capita term, the growth performance was not as impressive as it is made to be. And as I think Otaviano mentioned, the jury is still out on whether commodities export were driving that so-called African miracle of the 2 last decades. And so, if you recall, the continent has been relatively spared when it came to the health issue, but it was severely impacted because of its heavy dependence on external flow. And I would add to this external flow, in addition to the one that Laura mentioned, I would add some countries reducing their commitment. The OECD can tell us whether they actually reduced aid over the past year or so. But some countries, UK, others, Saudi, and many others have reduced their commitment toward aid. So, and this is perhaps signaling what's to come, and I'll come back to that. But in terms of remittances, receipt from commodities, tourism-centered economy, where very much hit Mauritius, Seychelles, and many others. And the continent, countries in the continent were somewhat recovering, albeit much slower than, of course, advanced other economy on account of the eroded buffers. And of course, they are still, for many, reliant on the support from the international community. And this recovery from COVID was with loads of uncertainty, and the continent is still very much lagging behind when it comes to vaccination rate, which are still below 10%. But now the triple impact of this Ukraine invasion may be the fatal blow for this continent, as I said, that is home to 70% of the world poor. And there we worry about, of course, the risk of spreading social unrest, and the continent has been subject to a wave of coup and civil wars that are raging, including in Ethiopia. On the consequences, I'll go quickly. There is the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is the oil, gas exporter, which are non-populous countries such as the Gulf country, but also a few African countries such as Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, who stand to benefit quite a bit from the shock stemming from the invasion of Ukraine. The bad is the oil and gas exporter, which are populous, the Angola, Nigeria, and others, the food exporters as well, but which tend to be energy importers such as South Africa, Morocco. And the ugly is those who are both oil and gas importer, but also food importer, and who are which are in debt distress, such as Ethiopia, Somalia, South Sudan, Yemen, Syria, and many others. Some who are in the midst of incredible political and social turmoil. So the aggravating factor are indeed high debt, distress, and issues of climate change that we will return to in the second part of the discussion. The mitigating factor, if you wish, are the existing social protection system, which are very fragmented for the most part, but which have allowed for some country to hold up. But of course, some part of the continent, the Sahel region, the Horn of Africa, are seeing droughts, and this is throwing 30 million individuals into hunger and famine. So the risk of social unrest is real, and that may spread also beyond the region. I'll finish by talking about the way forward on the debt structure, which has shifted over the last 2 decades. I think, as mentioned by Arvind, we are now faced with a changing structure of debt. In short, Africa has 30% of its debt held by private creditor, 30% by bilateral official creditor, and half of that 30% is China, and 30% by international financial corporation, mostly MDBs and mostly the World Bank. So the shift in structure has exposed Africa to new risk, not only to rising interest rates from this Fed hiking rates and potentially the ECB falling out, but also it has exposed this changing structure has exposed Africa to the vagaries of China, decided or not in an ad hoc fashion so far to restructure debt. And there are some bright spots in some countries. Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, Benin have developed a domestic bond market, but they are relatively shallow and expensive to borrow from. So waiting for too long would, of course, for the debt restructuring, we have major socioeconomic consequences. Even so, one would wish that this country would continue to retain access to capital market and domesticate their policy, so that this could be helpful to restart growth. And the DSSI, the debt suspension initiative, debt service suspension initiative, and has helped somewhat, but the common framework is very much stalled. And China is on the fence because its experience with DSSI has been one where it felt that he was doing too much of the burden sharing. So its approach restructuring with Zambia and others, that China is willing to enter that multilateral approach to debt restructuring. There are signs that this might be an uphill battle. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabah. Yeah, definitely not easy times for Africa, especially not for those countries who are not commodity exporters and therefore not benefiting from the high prices, as I said before. Let's now move on to the more longer-term structural challenges. I would like to ask you to be very brief, so that we can leave a little bit of time at least for some questions at the end. Let's start with Arvind and the longer-term challenges of the 5 regime shifts that we already talked about earlier. Arvind.
Yeah. Let me just focus on 2. There's a lot to talk about, but I'm just going to focus on 2 because I think these come out of some of these shifts. One is as it applies to the poorest countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. I think that the experience of COVID, the breakdown of cooperation means that more and more countries in sub-Saharan Africa will and should start thinking of greater food self-sufficiency and greater self-sufficiency in the matter of medicines and all these essential goods. Whether it's done country by country or a little bit more regionally, there's no doubt that there will be this turn towards, and I think frankly, the turn towards food self-sufficiency might not be a bad thing in my view, because I've always held the view that the most successful development transitions in the world, post-war, Japan, Taiwan, Korea, China, happened because they really focused on agricultural productivity and agricultural growth. And these were basically anti-Lewis models of successful development. And I think if Africa kind of, for extraneous reasons, turns towards food self-sufficiency, raising domestic agricultural productivity, it may not be such a bad thing. On pharmaceuticals and essential drugs and medicines, I don't know what the right kind of focus should be, but certainly the notion that global, international trade and global cooperation will protect you in times of adversity. I think that's been blown out of the window by COVID and by the recent experience on policy responses to food. So that's, I think, on the sub-Saharan African side one. The second, and I'll end with this, is that I think of this change from hyper-globalization to, whatever, not de-globalization, but de-hyper-globalization, as it were. What I think we're missing is that there have been 3 phases of that in the last 10 years. The first phase happened after the global financial crisis, which basically meant all over, trade to GDP ratios came down in the world, and manufacturing was especially badly hit. The COVID crisis has, I think, is also led to a kind of deglobalization, but differentially so. COVID, I think, has meant maybe more deglobalization in medicine and food and manufacturing, but actually it's thrown up opportunities for greater globalization of services. So if you look at a chart of global trade to global GDP, after the global financial crisis, in manufacturing, trade to GDP has come down, but in services, it's once again been steadily rising. So the whole de-hyper-globalization also has, it's not unambiguously negative, it also has this opening up opportunities in new areas. The third aspect of de-hyper-globalization comes from this geopolitical shift. One could make the case that all the geopolitics between China, Russia, and the rest of the world, the way it might manifest itself is certainly decoupling from China and Russia and quote unquote all the bad guys of the world, but it could also be greater globalization amongst other like-minded countries. And even as we speak today, President Biden has revived this Indo-Pacific Economic Forum. And I think that's kind of nodding in that direction. So what it means is that while de-hyper-globalization is going to be a broadly negative shock for growth and dynamism, more generally, there will be pockets of opportunity. For example, Soumitra Chatterjee and I calculate that after the global financial crisis, China vacated about $150 billion worth of export space, which other countries could take advantage of. Basically, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Indonesia have taken advantage of that, but it's an opportunity. The whole zero COVID policy is actually another opportunity for other countries. Investment fleeing China because of geopolitics is another opportunity for many countries. So, countries in the world, and these are only opportunities. These are not, destined to be turned into good outcomes. Countries will still have to do the kinds of right policies, but de-hyper-globalization has this, very kind of mixed, on the one hand, yes, but also, so these two dimensions of deglobalization and the breakdown in cooperation are going to have very different impacts, and maybe not all negative. For example, I do think if Africa becomes tries to become self-sufficient in food, it may not be a bad thing. The fact that investors are fleeing China and deglobalize happening may not be such a bad thing, may create opportunities. So to view the medium term in purely negative terms, I think would be a mistake. There are opportunities for countries, different countries, different kinds of opportunities with different kinds of policies. But I think we should beware of having an unambiguously negative perspective on some of these structural regime shifts, on the 5 regime shifts that I identified.
Many thanks, Arvind, especially for the also a bit optimistic view that you're shedding on the world economy and on EMEs. Let's now hear from Otaviano what he thinks about the longer term challenges or maybe also opportunities for emerging markets.
All right, good points made by Arvind. Thinking of Latin America particularly, I would highlight 5 aspects very briefly. Well, first, of course, the debt legacy, together with the need to do something, particularly in the context of rising populism and demand from the population for answer by authorities, will suggest literally that the countries in the region should review their public expenditures. See, countries will have to walk on a tightrope in between on the one hand, dealing with the debt, but at the same time, there is a call for a more proactive response by governments to help the population. Definitely, the region should avoid the shortcuts, and we are seeing many of them. Overextended subsidies. I have in mind the widespread subsidies to transportation in Argentina, but also, of course, the talks about reducing tax and subsidies, reducing taxes on fuels. We have seen this in several parts of the region. We have currently, yesterday, the new head of Petrobras has been taken out. And apparently this has to do with interest by governments to Bolsonaro to establish caps on derivatives price and so on. So the tightrope in between being responsible with respect to debt, but while at the same time doing something, this calls for a review of public spending and preferably resort to policies that work, such as cash transfers, rather than simply trying to manipulate specific prices. A second challenge, of course, is obviously the effects of the labor market scarring and the education scarring. And this is something that will require proactive answers by the governments. On the positive side, it's clear than ever, more clear than ever, that an agenda of green infrastructure investments is a way to go with the several gains being accrued to that, to restore growth and in a way. Of course, when I say green infrastructure investment, that includes reinforcing environmental safeguards, particularly in the case of Brazil, for instance, doing something with respect to the deforestation of the Amazon, as it used to be previously. And a final point on the opportunities, but also with challenges associated with the points that Arvind highlighted so well. I'm having in mind here nearshoring, friendshoring, Secretary Janet Yellen called it. Definitely the trade-off between resilience and efficiency has tilted to the middle, resilience and friendliness of partners. But this is no falling from have gain, because obviously deviating from the previous efficiency-based configuration of value chains will be costly. It will require subsidies. It will require public support. And there are several preconditions for such a thing to work out, to work well. Is not falling from heaven. Yes, there will be opportunities, particularly for some parts of the region, to enjoy the windows open by nearshoring and friendshoring, but there are requisites for that should be paid attention to. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Let's now move back to Raba, and then we end the second round with Laura afterwards. Raba?
Thank you. I'll make three quick points. So one on climate change, one on energy resource policy, and one on trade. I agree with very much what Arvind and Otaviano said in terms of pointing to the opportunities. But as we used to say for Argentina, we would like Africa to not just be a continent of potentiality, but really, I'd like to focus more on the realization. And I need to go back to some of the basic issues that were long-standing breaks to transformation. On climate change, so the continent is definitively a small contributor to climate change, with just 4% of greenhouse gas emission, compared to China with 23% and the US about 20%. But it's the most, the hardest hit, the most vulnerable. And we see it today with the 40 million individuals falling into hunger in Sahel region and the Horn of Africa, and Madagascar sadly being one of the first country to be subject to that climate change-driven famine. So the continent has an opportunity to, as a latecomer, to leapfrog in many of the transformation, including the energy transformation it needs to achieve. But for that, it needs to tackle its long-standing issues related to limited absorptive capacity. And when it comes to the energy sector, the basic reform of unbundling production and distribution, also tarification of electricity, issues related to the financial system, which needs to provide a kind of instrument to promote or to protect investors from currency fluctuation. And so I agree very much with Arvind that agriculture is a huge potentiality for Africa, but there too, there are long-standing issues related to access to capital, land registry, but also competition in the distribution and transport sector. there are opportunities also because of that Ukraine invasion when it comes to Europe trying to diversify its sources of energy. And we already seen many prime ministers and European leaders touring Africa, the Middle East to try and get access to energy supply, but not just energy supply, also key metals, uranium, and others that are essential for the energy transition. So there is a key opportunity there for Africa, short to medium run, to boost investment in this extractive sector. But as we know well, and Arvind, I think, also written on the topic, issues of governance have plagued the mobilization of this resource revenue and the actual use. So still, yet again, another important governance challenge for the continent. I'll end with the issue of trade. So there too, lots of potentiality with the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which was launched uneventfully in 2021 during the pandemic. And there too, the potential for developing or for reshoring and also developing their own supply chain in the continent are great. But when you look at the reality of what's happening in the continent, there are over 300 special economic zones, which all mark the individual country determination to forge their own path, but that's at the individual country level, and it's contrasting with this common project of building a 2.5 billion consumer base akin to the European project. So this tension between this fragmentation of the tax, competition, and trade framework that the Continental Free Trade Area is trying to build and harmonize is really telling you about the cognitive dissonance, about this coming together, which might actually, in practice, go in the other way around. And there are lessons from the European integration, and there I really agree with Arvind that being narrow and deep would really be the way forward, and agriculture is certainly one place where Africa should start. I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabah. Now let's move on to Laura as the last speaker of the second round.
So thanks. As a representative of a small country, I have to say, and actually someone that very much have to say that benefit from globalization. I born in Costa Rica, married a Brazilian, and live in the US. I do have to say that these changes are not going to be welfare improving. There might be distributional effects, and there might be countries that improve, but it's very hard to argue that overall we're going to be better. I think it's okay for countries to push for agriculture, increased productivity, but it's very hard to be self-sufficient. The distribution of fertilizer, but metals is not evenly distributed. Some countries have more minerals than others. Phosphor, potassium. Canada has many. They have energy. So again, there are opportunities, but overall, I just see how the lack of cooperation will be welfare improving. Costa Rica, we can survive on coffee and bananas. And you won't start with coffee and bananas. They're also actually very well balanced, but that is not increasing the welfare of people. Climate change needs cooperation. We cannot solve climate change in blocks. I also worry because diversification has always been a better policy. I do see a lot of pushing for a lot of bad policies that we tried before and they didn't work. And again, there are opportunities, but that doesn't mean that we're going to be able to overall increase the welfare. I also worry because we wasted, and again, maybe Costa Rica, many countries in my region, we wasted the time, as Arvind nicely put, of excess supply at low interest rates without doing what needed to be done. We didn't invest in education. We didn't invest in human capital. And so we need to keep in mind that even though there might be opportunities, many countries didn't take those opportunities before because of what Rabah said, bad institutions, bad governance. And so, again, I do worry about what would happen. It is what it is. I agree. We do see some breaking in cooperation. China has taken a path that it will be very hard for them to reverse. But it would be nice if the rest of us do try to foster multilateralism and cooperation. And again, I'm talking from the point of view of a small open economy. We cannot develop any other way. Thanks.
Can I just say one? Yeah. I think that I just want to be a little bit careful here about the cooperation message here. I want to point number one, cooperation overwhelmingly better than non-cooperation. Nobody disagrees with that. I think one. Two, cooperation has basically collapsed. We're in a G- world. Point number two. Laura, let me finish.
Laura, can you let Arvind finish and then I give you the floor?
Point number three, I think the West makes this mistake of seeing itself as great cooperators and blaming the others for lack of cooperation. I think that's just not right. On COVID, the West comprehensively failed the poorer parts of the world. Let's never forget that. And therefore, pointing fingers on others for lack of cooperation. I mean, I'm not saying that the Chinese inward turn, authoritarian turn, no question is bad news for global cooperation, but to think that that's the only thing that's happening, or that's what's led to all of this, would be a terrible wasted opportunity to look at ourselves in the mirror as well. Three. So four, therefore, the choice facing many countries, as you put it, Laura, it is what it is. If it is what it is, then I have to plan based not on hoping cooperation will happen, but on the high probability that cooperation will not happen. And then what do I do?
So let me just say, and again, let me reply.
Laura, before you answer, Laura, please.
One comment, because it's not true that all countries fail in terms of getting vaccines. Costa Rica, we got vaccines from the US. Okay, yeah. So it's not true that all countries fail. And by the way, India also played a role in limiting supplies to the rest of the world. It was not only the West. Don't
get personal, Laura. I'm exactly saying that it's not just China. I'm saying it's everyone else. So it's not a personal thing about.
But I also do want to say that some of us did get vaccines from the US, so the cooperation didn't collapse 100%.
Laura, you're not looking at the facts here on COVID. There's vaccine apartheid today, as bad as anything there was.
There is a plant in South Africa, and there is no demand for the vaccines. There is no, the plant is going to close for lack of demand. No, and I do want to make a point, because there is supply and there is demand. A lot of the supply problems were due to excess demand. But today there is a plant in South Africa that's going to collapse because of lack of demand coming from Africa.
Let's it's a heated discussion already with a lot of, I think personal, feelings attached. Let me maybe broaden the discussion a bit, because there also have been, some questions in the chat, and I think they're actually related, to this discussion also about cooperation and so on. I would also like to add some questions myself, and then we can also, hear the others, view on these two things. First question is, there's this question, I think, of challenges versus opportunities. And Laura, I think, had a bit more pessimistic view here than maybe Arvind. And the question from the chat is actually, can, these EMEs really benefit, from these opportunities? Maybe some can, maybe some not. And, what actually the policy requirements, to allow them to benefit, from the opportunities. And then a question from my side that I wanted to ask, and it's also related, what's the role for the more advanced countries here? First, in terms of maybe helping, EMEs to benefit from these opportunities, but also to avoid, through their own policies in an unintended way to put further hurdles, in the way of EMEs that actually would prevent them, to benefit, from the opportunities. I'm not sure who would like to start. Maybe you can, raise your hand and then I'll give you the word.
So
let's start with Arvind and then Rabah. Yeah.
I think both your questions are very good questions. Let me just give you one concrete example, right? Today's Wall Street Journal has a piece on Apple saying basically Apple, because of geopolitical changes, I mean, I do think they want to diversify out of China. So the question is, and they're looking for alternative destinations. And, one of them is, some of it has gone to Vietnam, some of it has gone to other countries, but they're looking at India seriously. But I mean, they're not confident. So for India, this is an opportunity, but to realize this opportunity, India has to do a lot of things much better than it's been doing. We know what that list is, a stable investment climate, a certainty of policy, ease of doing business, or openness. For example, India in the last 4 years, I've written about this extensively, has turned inward to its great cost. So all the things, and I think I'm completely in agreement with Laura on this, that, and what Otaviano said about human capital and Rabah as well, that, I mean, on balance, deglobalization cannot be good on aggregate. And I think there I do agree with Laura, but I think it's not all negative. There are opportunities, but all the things that they need to do to attract this is going to be in the hands of countries. And India is actually a very good example where, Apple and other companies want to come, but they're not certain about the investment climate and the whole regulatory regime that will make it a good place to invest, not for today, not for tomorrow, but for the next 10, 15, 20 years.
Thank you, Arvind. Then Rabah and then Otaviano.
Yeah, I just want to second what Laura said about the South African experience. It's a major blunder, several billion wasted on account of bad ideas. So I agree that while there are some opportunities, there are a lot of bad ideas floating around, and there's going to be a lot of hard work to be done to capture opportunities. But on what can the Western world or the richer country do, I would look at that moment we are in as not as a repeat of other crises, but maybe as a crisis that may be really protracted, maybe severe, much more severe than perhaps the previous one, especially for the poorest country. So I would think of stretching this backlash around aid, and that's coming because of a lot of the COVID policies in the north and the pressure to raise taxes there. So I think we're going to have to think very hard about how we stretch the potential for dollar of aid to help not just in the short run but over a longer period of time. So I would watch for designing a financial package that help countries realize that we are going to be living in a world where food prices are going to be much higher for much longer, as well as energy prices. So the kind of aid and the design of these packages would have to be thought through carefully.
Thank you, Otaviano.
Yes, just to echo Arvind's point about there has been failures to cooperate everywhere. Laura is right. You had some selective cooperation with friends. That's the case of Costa Rica. But overall, the US, like Europe as well, has failed when it comes to solidarity with respect to vaccines. We cannot deny that. And look, Arvind said it quite well in the following sense: the prerequisites for emerging markets to profit from the eventual opportunities, even if they are costly, like in the case of nearshoring and friendshoring, will depend dramatically on the domestic agenda regarding the business environment. Without dramatic change in business environment in most of these countries, forget about picking back on global value chains or regional value chains, because obviously what made a difference in the case of the export processing zones in China and in other places successfully was exactly having a business environment in condition to help that. So either the homework is done or Latin America will go nowhere in terms of creating the conditions to profit, together with, of course, getting success in doing some infrastructure investments, minimum ones. And of the business environment, the trade chapter, I think of Mercosur and the failure to push ahead with trade opening and so on. And by the way, going back to developed countries, the signals are not that good on the developed world side as well. Think of the disappointment with the US not bringing market access to the proposal brought by Biden to Asia, to the point that the Japanese diplomatically say that is, let's say, the second best after the successor to the TPP. The attitude when it comes to trade and market access by the US is not very much different from the one during Trump times. So that means that when it comes to the market access to the least, the advanced economies, including the US, must do something else. One point on Rabara was hit the nail on the difference among countries, and it boils down to analysis on a country-by-country basis. Let me quote Morocco. My colleagues at the Policy Center for the New South, for instance, give a look specifically to Morocco. Morocco is a big exporter of fertilizers. So you would say, well, fertilizer prices are going up, so that's good for Morocco. But when Abdelaziz, a colleague over there, made estimates taking into account the food imports and energy imports, at the end of the day, the net terms of trade effect was negative. So we have to look at each one of them. And finally, a call for the cooperation, particularly as cooperation will be necessary for mankind to face its major challenges. Think of climate change, think of cybersecurity, think of terrorism, think of the demographic change that will inevitably lead to migration flows. So more than ever, mankind needs multilateral global cooperation, and that has to be highlighted. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabah. Your hand is still raised. Is this still from the previous intervention, or would you like to take the floor again?
No, sorry, I'm gonna put it down.
Okay, no worries. Then I'll hand over to Laura again before we then close the webinar.
No. Again, for certain countries, there is no development without cooperation. Just so happens that the Brazils, the Chinas, the Indias, they're large economies. But for some of us, in this world where many countries are just willingly leaving the multilateral, it's a problem. And in terms of the vaccines, again, I actually do think we're economists, and it's good to have a very serious analysis of what was the role of supply, demand, and logistics. Latin America, once we got the vaccines, they were distributed. We had the logistics to distribute it. As my husband would say, in Brazil, if you give something free, you're gonna have 10 people in line very quickly. And to the point that I think Sao Paulo, some people were getting 2 or 3 shots in. They got. But the issue in Africa is more complex. And I think not to be put a role on the part of logistics and demand, I also think would be not being a fair evaluation of the problem. Moderna and Pfizer were very complex to distribute, and they require certain capability. And again, now there is the case of a plant in South Africa that is receiving no orders. So it is also a demand concern. But again, on the overall topic, we are going into a world where sadly countries are deciding to fend on their own, and it will be a worse world. I have no doubt about that. There are the distributional consequences. but overall it will be a worse world. Let's just keep in mind that the growth that China created in the last 50 years has seen the greatest reduction in poverty the world has ever seen. And so it's just unlikely we're gonna be able to replicate that in small regional groups. Let's also remember that some of the regional groups we tried to create never worked. So Central American didn't work. I don't know if Mercosur is a success. It's probably a little bit more successful than Central American agreement, but again, sometimes when you're stuck with neighbors you don't like that much or are complex, like my next door neighbor that is a dictatorship, it just becomes very hard. And again, so a call for the ones that still want that multilateralism is the way to go and is the only way we're going to be able to solve big problems like climate change.
Thank you very much. With that, let me come to the end of this webinar because we stretched the time already quite a bit. I would like to thank all panelists for sharing your views. I think, we agreed on some things, not on others, but it was a very lively and I think very interesting discussion that underscored, how big I think the challenges are and that, not all countries, are in the same position and that, things vary quite a bit from country to country, but also from one region to the other. So thank you very much. To all of you and also to our other participants, and have a nice remaining afternoon or nice remaining day wherever you are in the world. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much, Isabel, and to the panelists. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you indeed.